So here we come to the third of what I would say are four distinct sections of the Meno, and perhaps one of the most famous sections in all of Plato, the episode with the slave boy, in which Socrates tries to demonstrate this outlandish theory that he's proposed in response to Meno's paradox of inquiry, you might call it. Meno has said, "How will you inquire, Socrates, into that which you do not know? What will you put forth as a subject of inquiry? And if you find what you want, how will you ever know that this is the thing which you did not know?" Now, Socrates is obviously familiar with this. This seems to have been not an original idea of Meno's, but this objection is made its rounds in philosophical discussion. So that Socrates says, "I know, Meno, what you mean, but just see what a tiresome dispute you are introducing. You argue that a man cannot inquire either about that which he knows or about that which he does not know. For if he knows, he has no need to inquire, and if not, he cannot, for he does not know the very subject about which he is to inquire." So we get two versions of it, one from Meno and one from Socrates. I don't know if it would bear up. That is, that they're the same thought. I'm not sure that that would bear up under very close examination of what both of them say, but it seems to be in the same general area. That is, that inquiry itself into truth is impossible. If you already know something, you have no need to inquire. If you don't know something, then you won't know how to inquire. And as Meno says, even if you stumble upon it, you won't know that that's the thing you were looking for, since you won't be able to recognize it, since you don't know it. So it is a paradox and a skeptical objection to the possibility of any sort of inquiry into truth. And very, very fruitful. I mean, an incredibly interesting thing. And my goodness, does Socrates dislike it? To the point where he responds with this section here with a story that's kind of obviously not true. Right? I mean, maybe it's true in a deeper sense, but I think he's making it all up. And the object here, purpose here, is to come up with an idea that would allow for us to still engage in inquiry, even given the paradox. And what he says, basically, I think, is that the soul is immortal, and it's existed for an infinite time before birth, and during that time, it learned all things. But I suppose at the moment of birth, it forgets them, at least temporarily. But that all we need to do is to recover and remember and recollect that which we learned before we were born. So you can see how it would solve the problem, I guess, or not. I mean, whether this holds up or not, I'm not sure. But it's comes right. I mean, it answers Meno's objection, but it comes in a way right out of left field. I mean, it doesn't seem to. It's just crazy theory, that the soul's immortal and it learned all things before birth, and all we need to do through inquiry is to remember what we already know. So in a sense, we already know what virtue is. We've just forgotten it. And the process of philosophical discussion is meant to stimulate the memory and bring it to the surface, you might say, which is incredibly interesting, but I have no idea whether such a thing is true. And, Meno asks for some proof, which is completely reasonable. But he says here, "But if you can prove to me that what you say is true, I wish that you would." That is, that there is no learning per se. There's only recollecting. We don't need to justify the idea that we can learn something new, because no knowledge is new. We've already learned all things before we were born. So we just have to remember what we already know. Meno says, "Can you prove that?" Which again is completely reasonable. And Socrates thinks that he can prove it. And what follows the next few pages is a conversation between Socrates and the third character, and that is a slave boy. Meno has a slave that's been standing around, I guess, which is not unusual. I mean, Greek society, like most ancient societies, was a slave society. So a rich man like Meno, as opposed to a poor man like Socrates, could be presumed sometimes to travel with a kind of a retinue, one of which is his little servant there. And so Socrates, after confirming that this boy has never learned any mathematics, proceeds to engage in a session of question and answer about him about a particular problem in mathematics, and that is starting with one square. How do you form a square of double the area? That's what I understand it to be about. If you would like to follow this a little more closely, there are any number of videos or resource aids that actually focus on the mathematics here, which is not difficult mathematics, but I am certainly not the person to go through it step by step. I have in the past, and even I can follow it, so you could certainly follow it. It is intriguing because it has to do, the answer, of course, has to do with the relationship between the side and the diagonal of a square, and therefore of the different sides of a right triangle, which gets us directly into Pythagoras and Pythagorean territory. So who knows what message that Plato was sending by having the slave boy demonstrate his recollection of this particular mathematical truth. I think it's just pregnant with all sorts of suggestions, right? Given the importance of the issue in the history of Greek mathematics. And again, I'm certainly not the person to walk you through it. You can do it yourself. And again, there are aids, visual aids on the internet to show you what's going on. I may link to one or two if I find them helpful. But this is all meant to show that Socrates doesn't tell him the answer to any of these things. How do you find given a square, how do you find a square of double the area? My understanding it's built on the diagonal, not the side, not the double side. So it is meant to show, well, this boy, I never told him the answer. I just asked him questions and helped him remember what he already knew. This is supposed to be the proof that Meno is asking for of this really outlandish theory that there is no learning, that all learning is really recollection. And remember, this is a kind of seems to be an ad hoc theory that's constructed just to meet Meno's objection about the impossibility of inquiry. Although it turns out that it's kind of a central doctrine of Plato, at least the Plato of a certain time, that knowledge is just recollection. But in any case, it's fascinating, and it is also, again, there's all sorts of dramatic implications of this. For instance, that this little boy who's never had the benefit of any education, this little slave, is a much better philosopher than Meno, right? Because he's able, to stick with it and come up with something in the way that Meno's, not. Meno's always changing the subject and refusing to get to the nitty gritty of it, and that's always interested me. Other interesting things about it for you to think about it for yourself. And the main thing to think about is whether or not Socrates actually proves his theory with the slave boy. That is, does he actually demonstrate by showing that without giving him the answer, but just asking him questions, this boy is able to come to an answer about geometry, something he seemingly knows nothing about. Does this actually prove that he had the knowledge, let's say, latent in an unconscious way in his soul, just ready to come out? And so does this prove that all knowledge is recollection? That's for you to decide. At the end of it, Socrates admits something quite interesting. He says, some things I have said of which I am not altogether confident. That is, I think it's quite clear that he knows that he's stretching things a little bit, especially with the initial presentation of, oh yes, the soul's immortal, of course, and oh yes, it knows all things before birth, and oh yes, we just have to remember what we knew before birth and forgot. Some things I've said, of which I'm not altogether confident. I hope he's not, because it's rather outlandish thing to just propose. But what he says next is actually quite interesting. But that we shall be better and braver and less helpless if we think that we ought to inquire than we should have been if we indulged in the idle fancy that there was no knowing and no use in seeking to know that what we do not know. That is a theme upon which I am ready to fight in word and deed to the utmost of my power. That is, he knows that his claims have been very shaky, this idea of knowledge is recollection, but he's willing to put forth such a shaky thing because of the importance of the issue. That if we were to accept Meno's objection as final, we would just give up trying to know anything. And to Socrates, that would be a disaster. And that really ends the third of the four parts. It is very rich in suggestion. It's a very important part of Plato. But I think if you've been reading this, you know that this whole dialogue is very rich in philosophical ideas and in highly dramatic events.